Well, good afternoon. I am your pinch hitter of last resort since Steve Harris, with rather short notice, couldn't come here. We've already had some really excellent presentations about what I've been preoccupied with for the past months, namely COVID-19. I would like to share maybe a few thoughts to supplement what's already been said, but also just contemplate a little bit about what on earth is going on. Because not only do we have this epidemic, but we also have armed insurrection in many places in our country, and we have a cultural revolution. And I will try to be somewhat optimistic, as Jay Lair said, although I think we all recognize that the situation really is pretty bad. I'm not going to be this optimistic. This seems to be some people have. Let's all stay inside and still nothing bad ever happens again, or until we get this wonderful, safe, and effective vaccine that we'll give to all 7 billion people on Earth, and then we can all go outside again without our masks. Some of my observations will come from a group that calls itself the Catacombs Group. You know, Jim Imstrom talked about what's going on campuses, and there are people who are leading a very open and hopefully somewhat successful confrontation with these people. But there are also people who cannot speak openly without risking their livelihoods as being part of the academic precariat. So they may be mistaken for Marxists at the time, but they're doing everything they can behind the scenes to undermine the situation, to share observations, and that's what they call themselves. They're in the catacombs. We know that the foundations of our civilization are under attack. I very much appreciated what Melanie had to tell us about how to communicate better, because we all need to be communicating, and I think I will try to follow some of her advice. Although there's one piece of it that I absolutely defy, and that is I do talk to hostiles. Hopefully there are some persuadables who are also listening, but sometimes I talk to hostiles just on a one-to-one basis. They're always the ones to initiate the confrontation. It eats a tremendous amount of time, and sometimes I think I'm just plain nuts to do it. And I don't think I've ever converted anybody, but I do try to learn what they have to say, what they're thinking about, and maybe I just do it for fun, to be provocative, but that's what I do. I've run across some kind of interesting things. One is this 1968 book called The God Who Is There by Francis Schaeffer. I guess he used to be a very popular author. He is an evangelical theologian. And he notes that we all, in the past, when we talked to people, even if we knew they had an opinion diametrically opposed to ours, we could still communicate because we shared some of the same presuppositions. But this is, in many cases, or in most cases, no longer the case. The present chasm between the generation has been broken almost entirely by a change in the concept of truth. That we used to have this concept of the thesis and the antithesis, the concept that something was either A or not A, and if it wasn't A, it was not A, and that it was it was like the basis for the indirect method of proof, or what Frederick Bastiat used so capably as the reductio ad absurdum, that now we have the thesis and the antithesis, and then the synthesis, which kind of blots out the concept of absolute truth. And many people just do not believe that there is absolute truth. Those of you who are Ayn Rand fans will probably remember that in some of her philosophical work she talks about the importance of Aristotle, that something is either A or not A. Well, she of course was a militant atheist, but Thomas Aquinas also was very fond of Aristotle and of that concept things are either A or not A. And among the things they're trying to cancel in our universities is Aristotle and this whole concept of absolute truth. There are even people who have a problem with the idea that 2 + 2 = 4. You may remember that that was one of the mottos of the Polish Solidarity movement, that freedom means that we can always say that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. I mean, that's just a fact. And truth at many other levels is being attacked, even at the basis of basic biological truth. One of the insights from the Catacombs group is that we have this Antifa flag that we discussed here, but a lot of people are uncomfortable with the Antifa flag. They still are on the same side on most of the basic fundamentals, and the flag that they're flying, that you may now have to put on your ID badge eventually, and that's the rainbow flag, the LGBTQ XXX etc. flag, because that's sort of attacking biological reality. It's not a matter of libertarianism and thinking that people ought to be allowed to live in peace the way they choose to live. It's a way of denying just the basic biological fact. You know, you want another human being, you need one male and one female gamete, and despite the concept of radical materialism that seems to pervade society, they have this concept, there's a person, a spirit-like thing that gets trapped in the wrong body, and we have to acknowledge the truth of that, whatever that is. So these are the sorts of things that one is sort of being obliged to go along with, even though they are lies. We'll say a few things about the COVID pandemic and what's happening with this. It's not just that everybody's living in terror and everybody is being subservient. It's having the effect of destroying maybe the meaningful opposition to what's going on. We have like the left and the right, or at least one side and the other side, and everybody is just going along and with the Cultural Revolution, or at least not bothering to fight it. The people who are in academia find it very dangerous to do so. Even people in big business may find it very dangerous to do so. The people who might care enough to fight and might have some capacity to do so are small businessmen, and they are being crushed. Or then there are older people who have some of the old concepts of the foundation of our civilization, and they are being severed from their families. Oh, you can't talk to the old people. You can't go visit them because you might infect them. So it's not just a matter of, well, we don't care, we'll put people in nursing homes and more of them will die. It's a matter of we will pretend to be protecting them, and what we're really doing is protecting ourselves from some possible opposition. When we have the political debate, we know the favorite epithet to throw at persons is "you're a Nazi." That everybody they disagree with is a Nazi, and Antifa is supposed to be against the Nazis. And of course, Trump is maybe a Nazi, they say. Well, according to the Catacomb group, the Nazis are dead, they are defunct, and they are not coming back. That there may be a few skinheads running around out there may be a few people like that, but really Nazism is sort of a straw man. And when I suggested, well, Goebbels was the most effective propagandist who ever lived, they disagree with me, and they have a better background in this than I do. They said, no, Goebbels was not the most effective propagandist that existed. He was the most effective one who was left because he executed all the better ones. Remember that the Nazis were fighting the Bolsheviks, and the evil was fighting against a still greater evil, and the Nazis lost. But the concept of Marxism has become pervasive throughout our society with this concept of class warfare, the emphasis on the oppressed, the emphasis on we need to have absolute equality, except for, of course, the people who are dictating what is going on. So I think that if we're going to fight against the enemy, we need to kind of recognize who that enemy is. What are the ideas that are taking over our society? And is there any optimism about this? Sometimes you look around and think, well, not very much. But I think we must always have hope. We must never, ever give up and realize that a tipping point does occur. Even in some of these places which seem to be overrun by Antifa, it's turning out that the woke people are beginning to wake up when they find out that being in favor of Antifa and Black Lives Matter and all of that will not protect them from the mob, that they too may become victims of it. So we will stay awake. Another interesting thing that Dr. Cash pointed out to me, and also Dr. George Schrader, is when we were worried about this Wuhan virus and where did it come from and what is happening. This is a book by Dean Koontz in 1981, fiction author, and the book, like most of his books, has a lot of paranormal stuff in it, and you would think it doesn't have too much relationship to reality, but just kind of an interesting paragraph in this, that to understand what was going on here, you have to go back 20 months. It was around then that a Chinese scientist named Li Chen defected to the United States, carrying a diskette record of China's most important and dangerous new biological weapon in a decade. They called this stuff Wuhan 400 because it was developed at their labs outside the city of Wuhan, and it was the 400th viable strain of man-made microorganisms created at the research center. Now, I don't think he had any specific insight, but we do know that bioterrorism does go on and that it probably will happen someday, whether or not this is an example of it. I think this is probably a natural virus that leaped species between bats or pangolins or something and humans, and it has been pointed out maybe not quite lethal enough to be a good biowarfare weapon, but it certainly is a very good terrorist weapon and has got everybody in a state of confusion and fear. I think the topic of masks has been covered very well by our previous speakers. There are just a couple of things that I might point out about this. This slide is from the UK, and you see when they are introducing the mask mandate, where that red arrow is. And this is after we have seen this curve that follows the curve of virtually all viral outbreaks. It goes up to a peak, it plateaus, and then it goes down. And we're introducing this mask mandate at the very end here. So we can take credit for it, right? That we were predicting the second wave and we're putting these masks on everybody and the second wave didn't happen. Think how many thousands of lives we saved. And then here's another thing in California. It shows when the mask mandate was implemented. And what happened was that after the mask mandates, the death rate kept going up. It just keeps going up. So apparently the mask mandate didn't make any difference. But this is a very heated argument among physicians as well, that my own colleagues in the Arizona Medical Association are just in lockstep behind all of these recommendations, and if you don't believe them, then, well, there's something wrong with you. Maybe you're even antisocial and wanting all these people to die. Here are just some references on masks that I think will be in your handout. APS put together a very extensive summary of the research by Dr. Marilyn Singleton. She's also a lawyer who's our immediate past president. Mask Facts on APS has attracted more than 100,000 views. There's an excellent review of Science that I think Dr. Merritt also pointed out about the scientific things. And then there was a Lancet article back in 2020 that was a meta-analysis of the use of masks in SARS-1 epidemic, in the MERS epidemic, and a few cases, some of them just involving, in China, involving maybe only half a dozen subjects. And these involved a contact between someone who was known to be infected and someone who was or was not wearing a mask. And even though it's supposed to be statistically significant that you were protected by a medical mask worn by medical personnel, your risk of getting infected, of transmitting the infection with the mask was about 4%, and without the mask was about 8%. So this was, a 96% a probability of not getting infected if you wore a mask, and a 91% or 92% risk of getting infected if you didn't, or not getting infected if you didn't. And of course, if the person wasn't infected, it did no good at all. But all of these things just don't make any difference. The exact science about it doesn't seem to make any difference. About the lockdowns, William Briggs looked at all of the countries. I'm not sure how well this shows up there, but it's a scatter plot, and the green or orange did or did not have lockdowns, and the mortality rate seemed to be just scattered all over the place, whether you had a lockdown or not. And here was another graphical representation of that, and both of these are in the article that's in your packets about an editorial I wrote for the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons. Looks like it's all over the place. Lockdown, no lockdown, doesn't seem to make much difference. The viral epidemics, they come and they go. And what prevents us all from being dead? Here's an interesting book on the immune system. It's kind of at a level that most of us might be able to understand. This picture on the front is a microphage sticking out this projection, and it's going after a little bacterium in the foreground there. This represents the innate immune system. One of the good things about this pandemic is that we are learning a lot, that there is a potential for us to learn a lot. Before this, I had never heard of the innate immune system. I am so embarrassed to say I thought immunity was all about antibodies. That's the main thing they talk about. But all animals have an innate immune system, even invertebrates. And if they didn't, of course, they would die, because the world is full of pathogens. But our skin, our mucous membranes, have these cells in there called macrophages that are on the lookout for invaders that shouldn't be there. And they're called macrophages. Macro means big, so relatively on the scale of cells, they are large. And phage means to eat. And they just engulf and eat these organisms. And if it's in a more advanced animal like a vertebrate, then there's an adaptive immune system. They will send out signals to the adaptive immune systems in the bone marrow and the thymus gland that these cells should get mobilized and start to make humoral antibodies, or to provoke a T cell kind of immunity. The T cells are certain kinds of white cells that are professional killers, and if the target cells are properly identified, they will destroy those cells. If we didn't have an immune system, of course, we would be like the Martians in the War of the Worlds, when they came down to Earth and they were going to take over the place entirely. But what finally brought them down was the common cold virus. Maybe it was a coronavirus that people had learned to live with and to tolerate, but these foreign invaders could not. What could get us into a situation like this? What if we lived in a bubble? And if you do put a child in a bubble where he's not exposed to anything, then he is very, very susceptible when he comes out. If you put baby mice in a bacteria-free environment, their immune system does not develop. One of the most interesting paragraphs in that little book on the immune system was a section called Why Mothers Kiss Their Babies. In fact, all mothers kiss their babies, and in the barnyard, the mothers lick their babies. The babies, of course, are covered with pathogens and all things that could attack the baby, and it has a very immature immune system. It can't cope with it by itself. So what mother is doing by kissing or licking her baby is sampling the environment. And then mother can send these samples to her own immune system, create some antibodies, and secrete them in the milk, and to protect her baby while it is developing. There is a theory called the hygiene theory that children who grow up on a farm tend to be healthier on the whole than children who grow in a very sterile environment, where their mother is wiping off the things they hold on to on the swing set, and not letting them pick up things from the floor. Babies naturally put everything in their mouth, especially their fingers. But what they are doing is they are educating their immune system. It works kind of like vaccination, doesn't it? You take in a small dose of something and you learn how to fight it, and that you can fight it, and that's what keeps you alive. There's been some speculation that when people have COVID and they get over it and they've got antibodies, well, maybe their antibodies won't work very well, or maybe they won't last very long. So we can't depend on this herd immunity, even though every country in the world, one of the best examples is Haiti, which had a huge spike and then it promptly went back down to zero as the people developed immunity. Of course, you can ask, if your natural antibodies don't work, what makes you think the vaccine's going to work? Why would those antibodies necessarily be any better? And why would they last any longer? Answer, of course, is, well, they wouldn't. So here we have some things about natural versus vaccine immunity. We all have innate immunity. We have adaptive immunity. And vaccines, we generally talk about antibodies that they produce. This is the way we measure their effect. Like if they want to tell you whether you have to get another MMR vaccine, they will check for you for antibodies. I got out of taking one of those vaccines at my hospital because I still had measles antibodies from when I had measles as a child. It may be that vaccines also do lead to the development of some T-cell immunity, but that's not what they're generally checking for. When they're evaluating the vaccine, they're only measuring the antibodies. There is a potential side effect, and I guess there's adverse side effects to everything, that there is a thing called antibody-dependent enhancement. And that is, if you give a person a vaccine, it gets them an enhanced response to the pathogen. This was a terrible problem with the dengue vaccine. They worked for a long, long time to get a dengue vaccine. They tried it out on some people, and some of them had a horrible reaction and died because they had previously been exposed to dengue, and they just had this horrible overreaction. I asked a colleague of mine who was participating in some of the trials of one of the COVID-19 vaccines. Well, are they testing people for antibodies before they give them the vaccine? Apparently not. At least she wasn't aware of that difficulty. Then there's another thing called vaccine-derived virus interference. You may be told that if you get a flu vaccine or some other vaccine, it will protect you not only against the flu, but it may have some cross-reactivity with other antigens and may protect you against other respiratory infections. And in the laboratory, indeed, the influenza vaccine antibodies neutralize other types of respiratory viruses, some other respiratory viruses, not the coronavirus. In fact, it seems to have a paradoxical effect on the coronavirus. So it was speculated in this one article published, I think, in the military literature, that those who have the influenza vaccine may have a 36% greater chance of dying from COVID-19. This has been well disputed by the people who are very much in favor of the influenza vaccine, will say, go get your flu vaccine. And I don't know whether it is correct or not. One does want to ask the question, though, is why do people in nursing homes die of this at such a high rate? I don't know whether they've compared old people in nursing homes versus old people who are living out in society, but you can be virtually certain that everybody in the nursing home has had an influenza vaccine, as well as probably almost all of them are vitamin D deficient. a lot of interesting questions about why people die and why people don't, which has to do with how you can protect yourself against death. But I don't think that these questions are being systematically asked, so we won't know the answers to them. Well, I guess we have had this allegation at one point by President Trump, who was accused of constantly touting this hydroxychloroquine thing. I think he's maybe mentioned it a couple of times. But some interesting things have happened when people started to use this hydroxychloroquine. Its potential effectiveness was noticed as long ago as 2003 or to 2005. And one of the questions that Dr. Merritt has brought up that will be explored in greater detail in her upcoming paper in the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons is, what if we have been wrong for all of these years and all of these decades telling everybody, if you have a virus, you go home and tough it out. Take some Tylenol, take some ibuprofen, and hope that you get better. But we're not going to give you an antibiotic, even though patients will say, look, last time I took an antibiotic, I got better. You know, you can't ever believe what the patient has to say. But it could be that a lot of these drugs, including antibiotics, do have some antiviral effects. And then there is pretty good evidence in the laboratory that hydroxychloroquine may have an excellent effect against the coronavirus and other viruses by a sort of non-specific mechanism. It's not the sort of thing like it'll break down the bacterial wall and the bacteria can make an have a mutation, so it can make an enzyme to break down an antibiotic. This is something that has to do with the milieu of inside the cell, like the pH or the circumstances that the virus needs in order to replicate. That it changes the pH in the lysosomes lysosomes, and it allows the zinc, which may be the thing that actually does the deed of killing off the virus, to get inside the cell. Well, what happened was in Brazil they decided to try this, and you can see where that red arrow is. We have this curve of death, 7-day average COVID deaths, all of a sudden starts to plateau after they start using this drug. Purely a coincidence? Well, other things could have happened, I don't know. Not a randomized, double-blind, controlled trial. But here's a nice trial. It's not exactly randomized, but it looks at two different provinces, two different states in Brazil, one in the north and one in the south. And the one where they use hydroxychloroquine, the death rates keep going up, and the ones where they do use it, the death rate starts coming down. And here are some curves. They're following like the curve of viral illness, but they go up and then they come down. And way down here at the bottom that you can barely see, there's Indonesia, and it never gets that big spike because it just uses hydroxychloroquine. And here are some other countries that do or that don't use it, and you can see that I think in Peru they started to use it and then they stopped, and then the death rate started going back up again. So we do have some kind of natural experiments going on here. I think Costa Rica was another example, or maybe this one is Cyprus. And then there was also Russia. Russia started adopting hydroxychloroquine, and in this case we have the weekly recoveries, and the recoveries start going up. And then I think Russia has been maybe reversing its policy, and those things start going down. Here is a particularly interesting one. This one is Switzerland. I think we've heard before in this meeting about the Lancet article, which was a fraud, that said that people given hydroxychloroquine died at a higher rate, so it doesn't work and it may kill you. And this was a very highly publicized study, which was out in the literature for a while before Dr. James Todaro, who is an ophthalmologist, noticed something that the peer reviewers and the editors of this world-renowned journal, The Lancet, didn't notice, was that the data didn't hang together, didn't make sense. Turns out that couldn't be produced and probably was all made up. But Switzerland likes to follow the advice of WHO, and so it was going along pretty well using hydroxychloroquine with maybe a death rate of about 3 to 5%. When this Lancet article came along and they stopped using it, the death rate tripled. And when they went back to their previous policy, it went back down again. So here we have a kind of experiment. You do something, something happens. You change policy and it reverses it. I think that this may not be a randomized control trial, but I call it evidence. Let's see if I can remember what this is. What I have done is a lot of these things are printed from screenshots, and the quality of reproduction is rather poor. That if you get my PowerPoint, there will be larger pictures where it shows up pretty well, or you can look there. We know that Willie and others have been really critical of Twitter because of the way it censors people, but nevertheless, it is still allowing posts by somebody called @COVIDCrusher, and he gets all this data like from world data. What is world? I've forgotten the website. Pardon me? World in Data, yeah, and publishes these graphs. And this one shows that when the FDA strikes hydroxychloroquine off of its emergency use authorizations, the daily new confirmed cases per million people has surged here in the United States. So what these bureaucrats do has consequences in the world, but of course you can't sue them. I think we've seen this graph before, the countries that use hydroxychloroquine versus those who ban it or discourage it, and the ones who use it, even though they may have rather poor public health systems or medical system reputedly, have much better outcomes in their patients, maybe 10 times better outcomes, maybe even a much greater difference than that. But of course, I don't think we can admit that in the United States we could learn something from India. I hear a lot of a similar course of, on the red, the sophisticated medical countries that discourage or ban hydroxychloroquine have much poorer outcomes than those over here on the right who encourage it or who use it. And you remember that President Trump said that hydroxychloroquine was a game changer. Well, maybe it was. He touts hydroxychloroquine where that little red line is down there on the bottom. And the COVID daily deaths were going up, up, up. They plateau, and they start to come down. The daily deaths in the world outside the United States. So it could be that outside the United States, people were listening to this and they didn't really care whether Trump said it or maybe they liked Trump, but all they cared about was, might this be something that will help people get well and keep them from dying? And if so, let's try it. Some places it's available over the counter, like in Venezuela. Oh, I don't know whether you can go to Venezuela right now. In India, Jeremy found out that back in the 50s, they put chloroquine in salt. It was considered that safe, and they wanted to fight against malaria more effectively. So I think that it is really perhaps a great crime against humanity, and we'll look back on this with incredulousness about how in the United States we could be having all of these states, all but maybe 4 or 5 of them, who are making it very difficult for doctors to prescribe or for pharmacies to dispense this medicine that's been around for 65 years, has been used safely by hundreds of millions of people. Of course, like all medicines, I'm sure it does have some side effects. The other thing I've learned about this is that there are many other promising treatments, and these may not only apply to the current pandemic, but to other diseases that may emerge in the future or are still here. The hydroxychloroquine, zinc plus azithromycin or doxycycline may work just as well. Zinc plus another ionophore if you can't get the hydroxychloroquine, plus, for example, quercetin. Vitamin D, I don't know whether it will cure you, but without vitamin D, you cannot have an effective response to respiratory viruses. Budesonide has been used by a physician in Texas. He uses it together with zinc and clarithromycin. That is an inhaled steroid. Low-dose radiation, Jerry Cutler's treatment, that is extremely exciting. I have a book printed in 1940 that the late Don Lucky gave me, talking about gas gangrene and other things, but viral pneumonia, or just pneumonia, in the days before they had discovered sulfonamides even, there was a very high death rate from this. But people who got this low-dose radiation treatment to their lung were better within hours. Now, why would it be hard to take a patient with COVID down the hall if he can't breathe, and instead of intubating him, give him a dose of x-rays? Well, maybe they're afraid of contaminating the radiology department, or maybe they're just afraid of getting kicked off the medical staff for doing something that not everybody else does. But this is a very promising treatment, not just for cancer, but for infections, and especially when we have all of these bacteria, especially tuberculosis, that are developing resistance to our antibiotics. If we give them this non-specific sort of treatment, we could be saving a lot of lives. Let's see. Famotidine is pepsin, that seemed to work in some people. Colchicine seems to work for calming down the cytokine storm and the overactive immune system. Hydrogen peroxide or ozone. I guess the president was really ridiculed up and down for talking about giving disinfectants. But I did run across a case report of a doctor who had given intravenous ozone or hydrogen peroxide to patients in Africa with Ebola. Not a whole lot of patients, maybe 5 or 6, but every single one of them got better and lived at a time when the mortality from Ebola was about 100% or 90%. Why wasn't there worldwide excitement about this? There are some doctors who do give intravenous hydrogen peroxide, and they are considered quacks. And you're supposed to report them to the medical board if you find out who they are. But if you've got a patient who's going to die, well, why not try it? Hyperbaric oxygenation, there are studies using this, particularly in patients who are having respiratory failure. It enables you to oxygenate their blood without intubating them. Intubation has maybe a 50 to 80% mortality rate. And patients are not only being able to breathe better and oxygenate their blood, but they start to recover. Here's a new one it was new to me. Aviptadil, RF100. Somebody gave me a printout on that. I've been getting email from Gil Milikowski in Israel, where it's being developed. Gil Milikowski was a member of AAPS. Jeremy did a lot of work for him in that regard. And now he's off in Israel talking about this treatment. What this drug is a synthetic version of VIP, which is vasoactive intestinal polypeptide. Most people don't think of the GI tract as an endocrine organ, but it is. They're very important chemical messengers from the GI tract. And this just had a little personal note for me, because it was developed in the 1970s by the late Dr. Sami Said. And when I was at Parkland, and he was, I did some reviewed some charts for him. So I made one tiny contribution. And anyway, that's how I found out about the existence of this, which unfortunately I think many doctors don't know about. Then there's I forgot to mention here, giving the convalescent antibodies, have people who recover from this and have antibodies give blood. This is an old idea too. That's what we used to do for pneumonia, is we would give patients the antibodies since we didn't have any antibiotics. and interferon beta. There are many, many other things that you could add to this list. So if we really care about making people well, then there are all of these new therapies that should be investigated instead of just being smacked down and saying, well, remdesivir, for which there's very poor evidence, is going to be the standard of care, and we're going to buy 3 months protection of it, even though it hasn't been approved yet. And by the way, we've already committed to buying 100 million doses of a vaccine that hasn't been fully tested yet. And we'll plan to buy 500 million doses of it eventually. I think there might be a little bit of incentive to say that, oh, that vaccine works. And we've already bought all of this, so actually we better believe that it's a good thing. And here is our great guru, Anthony Fauci, who says that no matter how many doctors say they have successfully treated COVID-19 with hydroxychloroquine, we can't believe them until we have a valid randomized controlled trial in the middle of a pandemic. That takes maybe a year, a month to years to do. But on the other hand, that as soon as the vaccine is manufactured, it must be immediately delivered all over the world. Just, the hypocrisy is really pretty amazing. Proper studies can be done later. This is something that you might want to look at as the progress of epidemics throughout world history, and you find that COVID is way down at the bottom there, and things like bubonic plague, the recurrent epidemics of smallpox that came and then went away for no apparent reason, the pandemic flu, many other epidemics that occurred throughout history have been far, far more significant than COVID-19 without doing nearly the destructive effect on the population. Mark Morano already showed this one, that we have a mutated virus, that it's becoming the totalitarian virus. That the thing that's supporting this whole charade are uncertainties and lies of the number of cases, which are being sort of conflated with the number of deaths, or people are beginning to believe that we've got the surge in cases even though deaths are about down to normal. The source of contagion, that anybody that you walk down the street could be a source of contagion, and that's why we're going to track you on your cell phones. And if you come within 6 feet of somebody who might have had a positive test, even a false positive test, we don't know. And everybody who comes within 6 feet of you may have to undergo a 14-day quarantine. So we can have everybody in society constantly facing recurrent quarantines. The hydroxychloroquine data is really being suppressed, or and studies that are being published are highly questionable as far as they're giving the drug to people very far advanced in whom it has no chance of working, and worse than that, giving them toxic or lethal doses of it. And even if the papers are retracted, it's after they've gotten all types of media hype and have already believed and had their bad effect. And then all the hype about the supposed effectiveness of safety measures, for which there is no requirement for randomized controlled trials or controlled trials, or even honest look at the data that we do have. And this is one of my favorite quotes. The thing in yellow highlight is, the society of emasculated liars is easy to control. And I think that's what is turning a lot of us in, a lot of our doctors and officials into liars, and all of us into just terrified people who are running around in our masks and trying to be good little boys and girls. So if you have any questions, I'd be glad to address those.
haven't heard anything at this conference about the use of UVC lamps to disinfect against the virus in places of high density elevators and things like that. That doesn't hurt humans like the regular UV does. Is anything happening on that?
Excellent point. There has been a number of research papers published on it, and people are saying what we really need for the possibility of contagion is engineering solutions, not putting masks on everybody. UVC is it kills the virus. It does not penetrate past the dead layer of your skin or past the tear layer in your eye, so it's not going to cause skin cancer or cataracts. So it is perfectly safe to use in overhead lights, or you can put ultraviolet into air purifiers. Some of them have HEPA filters also, but purifying the air, that way you get rid of all the particles, not the few that your mask might filter out. So I think that this has great potential, and I think it's a matter of some urgency, especially with things like multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis. I think that when I was in the hospital back when I was in grade school, there was an ultraviolet lamp above the doorway. I was in an isolation ward because of a viral pneumonia, and we had this. I was saying, "What's that?" "Oh, that's a UV light." "Oh, why don't I see those anymore?" It would just seem like a logical and necessary thing to have. Thank you.
Okay. And can you tell us anything about the lawsuit that I believe AAPS has against the FDA on?
Oh yeah, well, how can I forget that? AAPS we have tried all kinds of things of communicating with the White House. Finally, we resorted to filing a lawsuit against the FDA and the Department of HHS and certain individuals in these departments who have been putting out this highly destructive comments about hydroxychloroquine, saying it should only be used in hospitalized patients as part of an approved, controlled trial. And this was being cited by state pharmacy boards and medical boards to prevent doctors from prescribing and pharmacies from dispensing under pain of using their licenses. We filed in the district court in Michigan in June, heard nothing about it. We filed a writ of mandamus with the Sixth Circuit, and we did get a reply from them, a negative reply, which we are now appealing to the Sixth Circuit to try to force the FDA to release the strategic national stockpile to which millions of doses of hydroxychloroquine have been donated that are either sitting in a warehouse or are thinking of giving them to Brazil or doing something with them other than letting the public have access to them.
Thank you.